Good morning, everybody. Barry Jones with SP History, continuing on with our Secret Service series and its relation or its part to play in the JFK assassination as part of the larger deep state and all the different operators that we've discussed so far. When we left off yesterday, we were answering the question about security stripping and whether or not there was any evidence of one, two, three, five instances where the Secret Service and their protocols broke down in Dallas. And if so, could a pattern be detected whereby it's pretty clear it was not just a blip on the radar screen? This was intentional. Hence the term security stripping. If you view all of the uh, breaches in security protocols as breakdowns, individual breakdowns, then that is the most charitable view you could have of the Secret Service in this event. However, if you're like me and you put all these together in context, you realize this is way more than just an individual breakdown or two. This is a pattern of security stripping for one purpose. And just a quick review, we discussed yesterday how, and the last 2 days actually, how the Secret Service first ignored all the advance warnings in Chicago and Tampa and Miami, and even the warnings of what might happen in Dallas, because Dallas was such a hostile city to JFK. Uh, and the thing that I would point out as evidence that they ignored these warnings is the fact, and this is an anecdote, okay, this is circumstantial, but after the fact, they refused to turn over any documents related to those advance motorcades uh, so that the Warren Commission and later the House Select Committee could juxtapose the Dallas motorcade versus all the previous JFK motorcades, because what they would have seen is there was a big difference. And the Secret Service didn't want the investigators to see that there was something unique about Dallas versus all the previous JFK motorcades. I think that indicates pretty strongly that the Secret Service uh, uh, wasn't really ignoring those advance warnings. They're fully aware. Uh, they were just determined that Dallas was going to be different, come hell or high water, because that was the plot. And turning over those documents would have been just self-evident. So they refused. Another thing they did is they traded out all the experienced personnel in the detail for inexperienced personnel. We went through a pretty comprehensive list. They got rid of the top two, Gerald Ben, Floyd Boring. Then they got rid of the driver. And then they got rid of 11 of the most experienced, replaced them with 11 inexperienced. And by the time they get to Dallas, the detail was a shell of its former self. They ordered uh, another man who was responsible for securing the help of the 112th Military Intelligence Division, Prouty. They ordered him out of the country so as to be out of the way. And then they called and ordered the 112th Military Intelligence Division to stand down so there's no security on the ground. So, in addition to stripping away the detail itself, the uh, the help that they normally received on the ground from the Military Intelligence Division, whichever was local to that area, was uh, told not to come. Then the 10 agents, 10 of the 15, the night before, spent the whole night out partying in Fort Worth at the press club, and then later in Dallas at the cellar. And we talked about how while they were there, there was moonshine, drinking, there were women, strippers, drugs. They lost their credentials, they lost their guns in the bathroom. Uh, and so the next morning, first of all, not only were they not providing security for the president at that moment all night long, they had firemen standing in for him. The next morning, they weren't sharp. You're talking about guys that had been out all night, so they were sleepy and inebriated, most likely. Um, and of course, they had lost their credentials and their guns. They removed the bubble top and blamed the president for that. Said, well, he didn't want the bubble top. It's a nice sunny day. They removed the two agents from the rear running boards. So there's some more security stripping. So two more agents that would have been responsible or may possibly been obstacles to shots from behind. They were missing from the limo itself. They removed 8 motorcycles, opening up the field of fire to the side and to the front. They removed Godfrey McHugh from the front seat, opening up the field of fire right through that front windshield. They removed the flatbed media truck from right square out in front of the motorcade, opening up the field of fire from the front. They changed the motorcade route, bringing the target to the shooters and winding him through city streets with tall buildings and two 90 degrees plus turns, slowing the motorcade down way lower than 26 miles an hour, down to 11 miles an hour. And then the the driver, who was a replacement, slowed, and I gave you witness after witness after witness saying that the motorcade slowed and came almost to a complete stop for enough time. Remember, there were 5.6 seconds from the first shot to the fatal shot. Plenty of time to get out of there. And of course, he has one mandate, the driver. As soon as there's signs of trouble, hit the gas, get out of there. He hit the brakes and stopped. And the president was literally a sitting duck under assault from these 5 different rifle spots. Roy Kellerman in the passenger seat never moved. He's supposed to jump over the seat. 5.6 seconds, plenty of time to protect the president. If you're not going to move the car, at least the passenger should get on top of the president. And he never moved. Uh, Stan Kenny, the driver of the backup car, was supposed to put his car in between the guns and the limo, never moved. The 7 of the 8 agents in the follow-up car never moved. The only one was Clint Hill, and that was to protect Jackie. And they all said it was because Emory Roberts ordered them to stand down. And he was in the car, of course, as the passenger, in the front passenger seat. And then we saw how most likely perps involved in the assassination of JFK had on their persons Secret Service credentials so as to provide cover for them in the direct aftermath. So if they were stopped, if they were questioned, they were detained, they could flash those badges and walk away scot-free. And that's exactly what happened. And I told you the story of Charles Harrelson, how his part in the mission was to deliver all these Secret Service badges. So that's where we left off. Today, I want to tell you the story of Thomas Shipman. I'm sorry, not Thomas Shipman, of Richard Douglas. Some people call him Chuck Robertson. I call him the second Thomas Shipman. If you recall, Thomas Shipman was the original driver, scheduled to be the driver in Dallas that day. And 5 weeks before the assassination, he just disappeared. He died. No toxicology test. No autopsy. Quick burial. Is no news, no public notice, nothing. So he just vanished into thin air. His family was very suspicious. He had just taken that comprehensive physical exam. He had no signs of heart disease. There wasn't any hereditary factors, no heart disease in his family, into drugs. He was in perfect health. They had just concluded that test, and yet he died in his sleep. And I gave you several scenarios for that. I think the one we settled on, or at least I settled on, is the fact that he must have had foreknowledge. Any other scenario, it doesn't require killing him. You can just force him to go on vacation like you did Gerald Penn, or you could just force him to stay home like you did Floyd Boring. But Thomas Shipman had to be taken out because I think he had foreknowledge, and he was a loose end. Well, we're going to find out today the story of Richard Douglas Chuck Robertson, another lieutenant within the Secret Service, and what happened to him. Seth Cantor, pictured here top right, a newspaper man in Dallas who is most famous for having had or claimed to have had a conversation with Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital when the president was brought into Parkland Hospital. Jack Ruby denied that he was ever at Parkland Hospital. Seth Cantor said, no, there's no question. I had a conversation with him. And anyway, Seth Cantor said that while he was at the hospital, a nurse right in front of him asked a Western Union man about a report that a Secret Service agent had been killed on the street during a motorcade. She had heard a rumor that a Secret Service man had been killed during a motorcade. and was anticipating him being brought to Parkland or anyway, the Western Union man replied saying, yes, it was true. This is the first that Cantor had heard of this. And so, of course, he has no reason to be suspicious. This is in real time. He's just assuming that whoever the perps were, whoever the Secret Service agent was, came into contact with whoever the perps were, and they had an altercation, and the Secret Service man, in an effort to protect the president's life, had given his life and died. He'd be a hero, right? Later, and then it just disappeared. The news went away. And we went through the news of the day. He never heard anything more about a Secret Service agent being killed. We went to the Warren Commission, the Warren Report in '64. No, very little talk of a Secret Service agent being killed. And it wasn't until Jim Garrison brought it up later that same decade, '67, '68, during the Clay Shaw trial, that the story grew legs again. Anyway, during this Clay Shaw trial, Garrison received a letter, and this letter was based on an article written by a JFK researcher, Penn Jones, and Gary Shaw. These are both pretty widely respected JFK researchers about this dead agent whom he knew nothing about. Here he is involved in a JFK case, knows nothing about a dead Secret Service agent. Anyway, the letter read as following, quote, a Mr. Richard Douglas Chuck Robertson, assistant director of the Dallas or Fort Worth Secret Service office, confided to a friend of the writer. So this would be either a friend of Penn Jones or a friend of Gary Shaw, who requested anonymity in 1963, that there was a plot to kill President Kennedy. It was planned. He didn't want any part of it. On November 22, '63, my friend was in the office of Mr. Robertson. And all of a sudden, all the phones began to ring about the time Kennedy was arriving at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. Mr. Robertson then said, quote, well, this is it. And he left the office. Since that time, Mr. Robertson's family of 7 children and wife have not seen or heard from him, yet his paychecks continue to be mailed to his home. Okay, so this author of this letter is not alleging anything other than the fact that Mr. Chuck, let's call him Chuck Robertson, that Chuck Robertson has just disappeared. All he's alleging is that his friend was in his office. Well, first of all, he's alleging that his friend was told by Chuck Robertson that there was a plot against the president and that he didn't want anything to do with it. And on the day JFK arrived in Fort Worth, before they get to Dallas, his friend got up, or he said Chuck Robertson got up and he said, well, this is it. He left the office and he hasn't been seen since. Now, what is interesting about that is his family has continued to receive the paycheck as if he's still alive, but they haven't seen him either. Now, when Jim Garrison is receiving this letter, this is '67, '68, '69, in that time frame. This is 5, 6, 7 years after the assassination. So put yourself in the shoes of, say, Chuck Robertson's family. Your dad goes to work one morning, he never comes back. And you don't know what happened to him. There's been no official word. There's been no news about it. No, the investigation, as so-called official, the Warren Report, didn't talk about it. You have no information, but you still receive the paycheck as if he's still alive, but you never see him. He's disappeared into the ether. So naturally, Jim Garrison is going to be curious about this. He goes back and he finds the Penn Jones Gary Shaw article, and this is written. Now, understand, the Jim Garrison. Let me go back here and show you the dates here. During the Clay Shaw trial is when Jim Garrison gets this letter, and this is based on a friend of either Penn Jones or Gary Shaw. Now, this is not based on an article yet. This is just a letter, a confidential letter about, hey, you might want to investigate this. This is what my friend told me. And it's either Penn Jones or Gary Shaw's friend, but the friend himself is anonymous. So obviously, Jim Garrison is getting all kinds of letters like this during the trial and probably suspected it was a crank letter. until he himself started investigating it. However, it didn't go anywhere. So that brings us 10 more years out into 1977 in January, when Penn Jones and Gary Shaw, who have investigated it, decided to run a story on it. And they said, quote, in their story, quote, our 1965 investigation leads us to believe that this guy Robertson was in Dallas, but was posing as a postal inspector. But it was reported to us that he had left Dallas. He also learned from the newsman that something unusual did happen on Harwood Street shortly before the turn to Main Street. If you're familiar with the motorcade route in Dallas, Harwood Street runs right in front of the old uh, Dallas Police Department headquarters. And it literally is parallel to the building. And that's Dallas Police headquarters is where Jack Ruby walked down that ramp and shot Lee Harvey Oswald on the Sunday, 2 days following. But it's that building. So Harwood runs parallel to the Dallas Police Department headquarters. It's not that anymore, but that's what it was. And then it takes a left-hand turn onto Main, and then Main goes all the way down to Houston, to Dealey Plaza. So as the motorcade, according to this article, as the motorcade was on Harwood, was approaching the turn onto Main, right there on that corner, quote, something unusual happened on Harwood Street shortly before the turn to Main Street. When I do my walking tour, this is one of my locations. I go to this location and show where this interaction took place. Uh, the article continues, no one wanted credit for this, but we were told by reliable newsman that a man jumped in front of Kennedy's car on Harwood Street shouting, quote, stop, I must tell you. The man, according to their report, was promptly wrestled to the ground and hustled away. Okay, so what this Penn Jones Gary Shaw article is alleging is that Chuck Robertson is a real person. He did work for the Secret Service, but he was in Dallas uh, posing as a postal inspector. And the news that they had gotten from their sources was that he had left Dallas, which is why he disappeared. He just left. They weren't able to resolve why his family never saw him again and why they continued to receive his paychecks. But in the investigation, as they talked to their sources, they found out that something happened in the motorcade at Harwood and Main where somebody jumped in front of Kennedy's car yelling something to the effect, stop, I got to tell you something. And then he was promptly wrestled to the ground and hustled away. Now, juxtapose that with a brief notation buried within the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. The Warren Report states that, quote, one of the Secret Service men on the field at Elm in Houston said that it came over the teletype that one of the Secret Service men had been killed. Now, remember what the nurse had heard at Parkland, that a Secret Service agent had been killed. That was confirmed by a Western Union man. Yes, a Secret Service man had been killed. And now this article, this letter to Jim Garrison stating that this guy, Secret Service agent Chuck Robertson, had disappeared on this day, hasn't been seen since, and his family continues to receive their paychecks. And according to this friend, he had been told by Chuck Robertson prior that there was a plot against the president's life, and that he wanted no part of it. And right before the motorcade began, he left the office saying, well, this is it. Like he was on a mission to go do something that might be hazardous to his health. And since that point, he's never been seen again. And now you have Warren report corroborating the fact that, yes, there was news. There was a report by a Secret Service men, not just one, within the motorcade there in Dallas on that day, that a Secret Service agent had been killed. And you juxtapose all that against the Penn Jones article in 1977, and you realize, okay, there was an incident at Harwood in Maine. And putting all these pieces together, it looks like it involved a Secret Service agent. And that he tried to warn the president that something bad was going to happen about 6 blocks away, and that he was wrestled to the ground and he disappeared. He hasn't been seen since. And according to witnesses, he was killed. That's what the nurse thought. That's what she heard. That's what the Western Union man said. That's what the friend or the Penn Jones or the that's what this notation from other Secret Service agents reported in the Warren report. And there's only one person in the Secret Service that disappeared that day and hasn't been seen since, and that's this Chuck Robertson guy. So you start putting the pieces together, and you think, well, Chuck Robertson's the one who knew of the plot in advance. That's according to his friend. He's the one that left in a hurry right before the motorcade, and he's the one that hasn't been seen since. And according to a nurse and a Western Union man and the Secret Service man who reported this to the Warren Commission, a Secret Service agent was killed that day. So you put the pieces together, and it looks like it's Chuck Robertson who was killed that day because of what he knew and what he did. Um, Vince Palomera has also written about this. And anyway, uh, Joseph Forrester was a U.S. Customs official that 3 years after the Penn Jones article in 1980 wrote a letter to Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, dated January 17, 1980, and he's offering his services. So this is another government official high up who's heard the same rumor, and he's offering his services to solve this mystery. Anyway, his letter goes as follows. It's a little bit of a longer quote. I'm going to read the whole thing. My interest in the Kennedy murder started in 1966 when I met an Air Force Master Sergeant at St. Albans Naval Hospital, Queens, New York. The sergeant, an elderly man, was suffering from terminal cancer. He stated that on November 22, 1963, he was attached to Air Force One as an electronics technician. In other words, he was with the president's plane. So he's at Love Field. He further stated that after the president was shot, a message was received over a military frequency that, quote, multiple assassins had attacked the president. A Secret Service agent, Mr. Robertson, stationed in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, disappeared on November 22, 1963, yet his family still receives his paychecks. The disappearance of an individual is not unusual, except that it has been said that Mr. Robertson became aware of an assassin's plot against the president. An assassin plot had been unearthed in Chicago a short time before President Kennedy's Dallas trip. Please do not misconstrue this letter. I am not a crank. I am sincerely interested in this crucial investigation. I am willing to join an investigative team, and if that is not possible, will make myself available for an interview by investigative officers. In other words, Joseph Forrester, while he was stationed uh, in at here he is talking about an occurrence where he met an Air Force Master Sergeant at St. Albans Naval Hospital. And somehow these two came into contact with one another. He said that he had grown interested in the JFK murder mystery in 1966. And no doubt they start talking about it because this Air Force Master Sergeant was in Dallas the day JFK was killed. He was on Air Force One. And he says, hey, this is what happened while I was there. We got this message over a military frequency that that in itself is an interesting characterization. Multiple assassins had attacked the president, and that a Secret Service agent named Chuck Robertson, who had been in Dallas, stationed at the Dallas-Fort Worth area, had disappeared on that day. Yet his family still receives his paychecks. Now, no doubt, this guy by this point had been exposed to the Penn Jones article because he almost quotes the Penn Jones article word for word. So there is that to take into consideration. But the fact that this message came over military frequency about multiple assassins and how a Secret Service agent was caught up in the middle of this and disappeared on that day, caused Joseph Forrester, sort of a JFK researcher in his own right, to look into this and consider it a story worth pursuing. So he offers his services to the Attorney General in 1980 to help investigate. Of course, it's never been investigated. We don't know anything about it, right? But the fact of the matter is, the facts are still the same. This guy, Chuck Robertson, disappeared on the same day JFK was killed. And you put the pieces together. You have at first a friend of Penn Jones / Gary Shaw who says that he knew Chuck Robertson. They were friends, and that he had been told by Chuck that there was a plot against the president. He didn't have anything to do with it, and that he was in Chuck Robertson's office on the day. And when the phone started ringing, he said Chuck Robertson got up, said something rather cryptic. Well, this is it. Grabbed his jacket and fled the office. It hasn't been seen since. Then, in the aftermath of that, a nurse at Parkland heard a rumor that a Secret Service agent had been killed. She asked the Western Union man. He confirmed it. Then you have the Jim Garrison, the letter that's sent to Jim Garrison, basically saying that this guy, Chuck Robertson, knew of a plot in advance, disappeared on that day, hasn't been seen since, and yet his family continues to receive his paychecks. Then you have the Penn Jones article in 77, whereby they are able to unearth the fact that he is indeed, he was in the Dallas area. He was posing as a postal inspector, but he was with the Secret Service in Dallas that day. And he allegedly had information of a plot in advance. And when he left the office, he hasn't been seen since, and his family continues to receive his paychecks. So you start putting these pieces together, and you've got multiple reports. And then you get to the Warren report itself, and they too heard reports from other Secret Service men on the ground that day that a Secret Service agent had been killed. Now, there's only one Secret Service agent that didn't make it back from Dallas. Now, we've already heard that Thomas Shipman didn't make it to Dallas, but I'm talking about of the ones that were in Dallas that day. There's only one who didn't. Now he didn't come from D.C. to Dallas. He was already stationed there. But there's no one else on record who's disappeared. Only one person disappeared. Only one family continues to receive paychecks for their dad and for their husband, from whom they've had no contact. They've not seen him since the day JFK died. He's just gone, disappeared. And we have a nurse, we have a Western Union man, we have the friend of Penn Jones and Gary Shaw, we have the Warren report and the several Secret Service agents who reported the same thing. We have this former Air Force Master Sergeant at St. Albans Naval Hospital telling Joseph Forrester the same story. In other words, there's enough smoke here to indicate that there may be a second Secret Service agent who was a loose end and who had to be neutralized. The first one was neutralized before the trip itself because they knew he'd be a problem. The second one proved to be a problem on the ground that day and was quietly disposed of. I mean, that's something happened to Chuck Robertson. Where is he? Where did he go? As I mentioned, his family has not seen him since. And yet the paychecks keep coming, almost like the Secret Service is buying the silence of the family. I can't find anything other than this information to share with you. The Warren Commission didn't go into it, investigate. It's just a notation in one of the volumes. So they're aware of it, but they didn't investigate it. And it's just poof, gone away. It's like the guy never existed, sort of like Thomas Shipman never existed. So what my working theory is, and I can't prove it, but this is my working theory, is that this is another anecdote that shows complicity by the Secret Service whereby they had internally a loose end, just like Thomas Shipman threatened to be a loose end. He had to be neutralized. In the same manner, Chuck Robertson had to be neutralized. Now, the difference between the two is Thomas Shipman, they could take out in advance in the dark of night at Camp David where there's no witnesses. And the only people that uh, are allowed, are suspicious in that whole scenario was Thomas Shipman's family, who knew he had just passed that comprehensive physical exam. And the fact that he didn't have a toxicology, and the fact that he didn't have an autopsy, the quick burial, the pressure by LBJ's doctor, Berkeley, to have him buried. But no news release, no public uh, announcement, nothing, no obituary, nothing. All right. But they can sort of control that because this is 5 weeks before Dallas. And then, but in Chuck Robertson's case, a little harder to control. He wasn't coming out of the White House detail in DC. He was coming from the Dallas Fort Worth office. So if he was a loose end prior, they may not have been aware of it until all of a sudden he's bum rushing the JFK's limo in the motorcade, making a scene, and then all of a sudden they're forced to deal with it. And now, unfortunately for them, there's witnesses. There's people on the ground, like a Western Union man. There's a Air Force Master Sergeant back in Air Force One who is privy to an announcement that comes over a military frequency about a dead Secret Service agent. There's a nurse she's at Parkland. She hears rumors of a dead Secret Service man. There's the circumstantial evidence of the friend who knew Chuck Robertson and said Chuck Robertson had told him there was a plot against the president, didn't want any part of it, and was in his office when he fled the scene once the president's motorcade began, and hasn't been seen since. There's the circumstantial evidence of his family not seeing him since and having his paychecks mailed to his mailbox. There's the notations in the Warren reports volumes about Secret Service agents reporting to them the death of a Secret Service agent. And there's this guy, Joseph Forrester, who wants to help investigate it because he believes it to be true. Now, it doesn't mean it is, but he believes it to be true. So I just think it's a situation where the Secret Service got caught a little bit with their pants down in the moment, in real time, having to deal with one of their own who had become a gigantic problem. And they disappeared him. And they paid off the family. And they squelched as much of the information as they could, the evidence that they could. But they couldn't squelch everything because there were witnesses. So this is an enduring question, but it contributes to the overall. If Thomas Shipman hadn't happened 5 weeks prior, I think this story has less credibility. But when you take it in context, this is why it's important to put all this together and in bullet form to show all the different security breakdowns. And you realize they're not breakdowns, it's security stripping. And then to show what happened to Shipman and Chuck Robertson in context shows that the Secret Service has ways of dealing with loose ends that are from within. And in both cases, I mean, I don't know if Chuck Robertson has ever been declared dead, but I guess by now, for sure he has. But no doubt, I mean, the fact that he disappeared, it didn't take one long before he was declared dead. And the only thing that happened, there's no record. If he died of natural causes, wouldn't we know? If he died as a result of a crime, would we not know? There's something suspicious about the fact that we don't know anything, that his family doesn't know anything, that they continue to receive his paycheck, that it just, 1 minute he's there, next minute he's gone. And then when you put it in context with what he told his friend, allegedly, prior, it shows prior knowledge. And if you remember, the scenario we picked that made the most sense for Thomas Shipman was that he had prior knowledge and he wasn't going to go along with the plot. Well, here we have Chuck Robertson, who clearly, if it's to believe what he told his friend, that he had prior knowledge, and he said so himself that he was not going to go along with it, you have the same scenario. You have two Secret Service agents who had prior knowledge and who were not going to cooperate. They weren't going to go along with it. If they don't have prior knowledge, and then there's no need to kill them. There's no need to take them out permanently to silence them because they didn't know. It's only if they have prior knowledge that they become a problem, especially when you add in the fact that they weren't going to go along with it because now they're a loose end. And there's only one way to deal with it. Remember, I always go back to this. Carlos Marcellus said three men can keep a secret as long as two of them are dead. And here you have two Secret Service agents, both of whom had prior knowledge, both of whom, according to the family, Thomas Shipman would have never gone along with Dallas. What happened there? He would not have reacted the way Greer reacted as driver of the car. And then, according to Robertson's friend, he said so himself. He was not going to go along with the Dallas plot. So both of these guys have prior knowledge. Both of these guys declared their intentions not to go along with any plot, and both of them disappeared. So I think that's a fascinating aspect to this whole story. Now the question is, did Secret Service malfeasance end motorcade? We've compiled quite a list of malfeasance. Some people call them security breakdowns. I call it security stripping. And then this little interaction with Chuck Robertson again begins the evidence suppression. But it starts with him, but it continues. Just some quick images here. This is the picture of the hearse preparing to pick up JFK's body from Air Force One. This is back in Washington. The body's been stolen, taken out of Dallas, where the autopsy should have been carried out or performed, and instead it was put on Air Force One, taken back to DC, so the autopsy could be under control. It could be under control of a military hierarchy, and that's why the room was full of military generals directing the autopsy. So that's I think in the movie JFK, Oliver Stone has a real interesting way of characterizing it. The takeoff from Dallas on Air Force One was more it was less a takeoff than it was a getaway. Here's some more pictures. This is the limo, top left and the top right, as nurses. When the limo first arrived in Parkland, they got the president out. Everybody emptied out of the limo. This is what they saw. You saw the blood, brain matter. It was a mess. And you can see down bottom left, the the trunk is open and pieces of the bubble top are sitting out on the ground. The car is wide open. It's there's no roof on it. So these nurses that are gathered around, some of them are putting pencils through the bullet hole in the front windshield. Took a pencil, stuck it right through it. Some of them are coming around looking at the back seat, the crime scene. It was right there for everybody to see. And of course, everybody gawks at something like that. And here's another bottom right, another picture of different aspects of the back seat of the limo there. This is a rolling crime scene. Keep that in mind. Okay. This is where the murder took place. So this is a crime scene. So, you know, when you're a kid and you see a crime scene, there's always yellow tape, right? And if you've seen any movies, you know you can't disturb the crime scene. The crime scene is sacrosanct. It has to be protected at all costs. There's evidence in there that might help you solve the crime. That's what this is. It's a crime scene. And today we're going to talk about Thomas Kelly. This is the third guy. One of the questions we asked, I think, in the second episode was, do you have to corrupt all the people in the Secret Service to corrupt the Secret Service? The answer is no. You just have to corrupt the top 3 or 4 people. And we've already talked a lot about Raleigh, the head of the Secret Service, how he changed all the personnel. We've already talked about uh, Roberts, Emory Roberts, the guy on the ground, who's basically Raleigh's man in Dallas to make all these decisions that turn out to be fateful decisions. And I told you we'd talk about the third guy, and here he is, Thomas Kelly. His title was inspector, but he's the guy that Raleigh sends to. Raleigh's in charge of all this. Okay. He's the guy that gives Emory Roberts the assignment to carry out in Dallas. And he knew that Emory could be trusted to do exactly what he wanted. Same thing with Kelly. He's his inspector. And once the shooting happens, you got to assume that the Secret Service realizes instantly they're the first fall guy because their only job is to protect the president. Of course, they didn't do it. So there's going to be, of all the conspirators, the one most exposed in this initially is the Secret Service. So you better have boots on the ground that know what the plot is. They know what the narrative is supposed to be. They know the story that's supposed to emerge from this, who can clean up the scene so as to protect the image of the Secret Service. Because remember now, the Secret Service going forward still wants to, relies on credibility to carry out its mission, which is to protect future presidents. And so they're going to be very keenly interested in protecting the image of the Secret Service. Remember, immunity. We talked about ultravirus and how we do what's in our best interest and not what's in the public interest. And if you don't, we fire you, we get rid of you, we have means of disposing of you. Like we just saw with the Secret Service, they had 2 people within their own ranks that were not acting in their interest. They were just in the public interest. And so they were fired, in their case, permanently disposed of. And the last part of it is they always cover themselves with immunity so that they don't face any sort of accountability. That's Thomas Kelly's job. He's the immunity guy. And he is sent to Dallas to clean up the scene. And then later, he becomes the liaison between the Secret Service and the Warren Commission, the body charged with investigating the crime. Just like Dulles acts as the liaison between the Warren Commission and the CIA, just like J. Edgar Hoover acts as the liaison between the Warren Commission and the FBI, Thomas Kelly acts as the liaison between the Warren Commission and the Secret Service. These guys have one job, and that's to protect the interests of the agency that they represent. So here he is pictured in the back. You can see him already. Lee Harvey. This is in Oswald's already been arrested. He's being paraded up and down the hallways, Dallas Police Headquarters, and there's Thomas Kelly. There he is. So he has a hatchet man. I'm introducing to you 2 new people today, Thomas Kelly and Elmer Moore. Elmer Moore is the hatchet man. He's the muscle. And he does whatever Kelly tells him to do. And the first job is to get to Dealey Plaza and seize as much of the photographic and film evidence that exists that he can find and seize it so that news organizations can't get their hands on it. Spectators can't, today it would be all over Twitter, right? Or X, it'd be on Instagram or whatever. Back then, if you had something important, you'd have to sell it to a news outlet or give it away to a news outlet, whichever. But the point is, you can't go be a news person yourself and direct access right into social media. So I don't think this would be possible today after the fact. People would be live streaming stuff like this. But back in those days, it was. Nothing had really uh, made it into the public uh, sphere yet, the consciousness yet, because it hadn't been broadcast yet. So there was a little bit of lag time where the Secret Service could go confiscate all this stuff, promise to give it back later, never do. And so a lot of this evidence just disappears in the moments after because Thomas Kelly was there directing Elmer Moore to go get it. And let me tell you, Moore was a big old guy. You didn't mess with him. So when he came and threatened you and flashed Secret Service badges, if you're just John Q. Public and you have a camera, you're going to turn that camera over. Or if you have a roll of film, you're going to turn it over. Uh, if he finds you, and remember, there's people running all over Dealey Plaza after the fact, flashed Secret Service credentials. So they knew who had the cameras, who was taking the photos, what witnesses they had to twist their arms to make sure the story fit the narrative, et cetera, et cetera. That was handled by Elmer Moore, who was acting on the orders of Thomas Kelly. This is a picture of Elmer Moore, and he is widely regarded as a Secret Service enforcer. And that's why he had this job. One of the second jobs that he had was to leave Dealey Plaza after he got that situation contained, go to Parkland Hospital and contain the Parkland doctors who were starting to emerge with their stories about bullets hitting the president in the front, back of the president's head being blasted out. That was not the narrative that the government wanted. That was not the narrative. They wanted all the shots to come from behind. So instead of the president having an entrance wound in his neck, that had to be an exit wound. So you got to change the stories of the doctors. Instead of the fatal shot to the head being to the front of the head, blasting out the back of the head, had to be to the back of the head, exiting the front of the head. I've always found it interesting. The fatal bullet was a frangible bullet, which means it explodes on contact. And it creates a small entrance wound, but a massive exit wound. And all of these, and of course, the doctors on the ground, in Parkland, they knew that. So as soon as they saw the injuries up to the president's head, their determination was that, that headshot being a frangible bullet was uh, from the front because the back of the head was almost gone. The brain literally fell out when they picked his head up. So they had to wrap towels around just to keep the head, the brain, everything contained. So it was an easy determination. And then they looked at the neck one and they realized that bullet hadn't traversed, which means it hadn't gone through, which means obviously it was a front shot, right? And it was not a frangible bullet, which is an interesting detail because if one shooter shot the president, fired all the shots, would they not all be the same kind of bullets from the same gun? Unless he's changing guns or something, they'd be the same kind of shells, right? So how could one shell that hit him be not frangible and the other shell that hit him be frangible? It indicates right there a minimum of at least two shooters, right? Anyway, these doctors are coming out with these inconvenient stories about where the entrance wounds were in the front versus the exit wounds, and and there are other witnesses. It's not just the doctors. We'll get to a couple others here in a minute. So that was another Elmer Moore responsibility, to get to these doctors and influence their testimony. And he was successful with most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And it's again, you use your leverage. And there's been a recent documentary come out from all these Parkland doctors they were all young at the time and they were scared it would ruin their careers if they told what they really knew. And so they went along with uh, the intimidation from the Secret Service to in most cases they went along with it so as not to hurt their careers. And now here we are 60 years later and they're speaking out for the first time. Then the next part of the Secret Service's evidence suppression on the ground that day was to steal JFK's body. And they literally, by force, at gunpoint, removed JFK's body, in spite of the fact that state authorities were protesting. They just bullied them, and you know, assassination and or murder was a state crime at that time. It wasn't a federal crime. The investigation should have been in Dallas. The autopsy should have been in Dallas. But instead, they got it out of Dallas back to D.C., where they could control these military doctors and this military autopsy. And this Bethesda autopsy was not really about uh, performing or creating an autopsy. I mean, about conducting an autopsy. It's more about creating one and creating a bullet trajectory and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't a legitimate autopsy. In fact, it's interesting when you hear Cyril Wecht talk about it. One of the things that became really important to the autopsy in 68 of RFK was, according to Noguchi, the guy that was supposed to carry it out, he went and got all the best and brightest around the country and says, come help me do this autopsy. Because the last thing I want to do is screw up the autopsy like JFK's autopsy was screwed up. Everybody knew from the get-go. I mean, I shouldn't say everybody, but it's widely known now that autopsy was a clusterfuck, intentionally so. And in 68, the autopsy of RFK was decidedly not a clusterfuck because Noguchi was determined to make sure that the best and brightest were all involved in this autopsy so as to maintain credibility going forward. So that's the purpose of stealing the body. And of course, the Secret Service was in charge of that. So there's another case of evidence suppression. Now we were talking about the limo. Once the body was removed, Secret Service, Kelly and Greer and Moore, they all saw people gathered around looking at it, gawking at it. They said, oh, we got to get this out of here. Remember, this is a crime scene. So the first thing he does is he drives this limo around the other side of the hospital away from prying eyes, and he scrubs the limo clean. I mean, he literally, with a bucket of water and soap, scrubbing the crime scene. Parkland nurses said later, we were all gathered around looking at it. We saw the bullet hole, put a pencil through it, and then Greer came and pushed us all away and drove it around. And next thing you know, he's cleaning the thing. They put the bubble top back on it. You saw in that earlier picture I showed you, they were pulling it out of the trunk, assembling it to put it back on it. Then they flew the thing by cargo plane back to DC and eventually to Dearborn, Michigan to have it rebuilt. And here, this is a crime scene. No doubt it's got ballistics evidence. No doubt it's got physical evidence. There's all kinds of evidence that could have been derived from this limo. We never got the chance. The Secret Service wiped it clean. It destroyed the evidence. But that was their purpose. That was their job. Remember, there was 2 Secret Service agents that were driving that thing, or one, and the other was in the front seat. And so they have jurisdiction over the car. And they took it, and it disappeared, just like those agents disappeared. Then we didn't find this out till years later, but Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days later gets shot by Ruby, and as he's lying on the as he's in the hospital on his deathbed, basically dying, a phone call from the White House to the room, actually it's to the hospital, from LBJ, the new president, who requests to be patched through to the Secret Service. And he orders the Secret Service to stand guard by Lee Harvey Oswald's bedside to, quote, take a final deathbed confession if Oswald ever regained consciousness. Now, there's several things that pop out there to me. If Oswald regains consciousness, is that not indicative that he could possibly live? And yet LBJ said take a final deathbed confession if he regains consciousness, almost like he was coding it to the Secret Service, saying, if he wakes up, get a confession out of him and make sure that's the last thing he ever says. Another way you could look at it is that LBJ is, again, coding information to the Secret Service such that I don't want anything coming out of that guy's lips that counters the narrative. So I want you by his bedside to make sure he doesn't say anything that hurts the narrative, which we've already determined he's the guy. We don't need him blurting out something that he knows. So this is the new president. This is why I know that I believe these conspirators were aware of each other and their respective roles in this plot. This is the new president who had his part to play, ordering another part of the conspiracy who has their part to play. And in this case, it's to squelch all the evidence coming out of Dallas. And he feels comfortable giving this order because the Secret Service is in as thick, there's in as deep in this as he is. So this is one conspirator talking to another to suppress this potential evidence. Isn't that amazing? By the way, that story is corroborated not just by this a record of a phone call from the White House to the hospital, but from the dispatcher at the hospital who transferred the call to the room. She told of this phone call from LBJ. Of course, she didn't know what he says, but there was a doctor in the room who overheard this. So this is corroborated by several different witnesses that this happened. And then to complete the picture in the subsequent investigations, once everything is tidied up in Dallas and brought back to DC, in the subsequent Warren Commission investigation, and then eventually the House Select Committee investigation in the late 70s, the Secret Service refused to produce. They said they couldn't produce any of the documents relating to previous JFK motorcades. They said that all his records had been destroyed. It was a matter of routine. And so a good source on this is Harold Weisberg, talking about the Secret Service cover-up. And he includes a big portion there about the FBI as well. But that's a really good source to check out. Anyway, the point is, remember this liaison, Thomas Kelly, is now acting as the liaison between the Secret Service and the Warren Commission. And later, 10 years, 15 years later, when the House Select Committee is investigating, Secret Service itself refuses to turn over any documents. So it was a complete and utter whitewash. Those documents would have been damning. It would have showed a clear line of distinction between all the previous motorcades and everything that happened in Dallas. And the obvious questions would have been, why was Dallas so unique? And not that Dallas was more secure. In every case, it was less secure. And yet it was the more dangerous city. It was the most dangerous motorcade. Now, clearly, looking back in hindsight, you say, well, of course, that's obvious. But we have already shown in the lead up to Dallas how dangerous things were becoming for JFK. And if you know anything about Dallas in 1963, it was hostile to JFK and his ilk, so to speak. And so, if anything, the Secret Service should have been on high alert. What those documents would have shown is that they were more than just negligent. And I think they knew that. So they said, well, we would rather have to deal with the destruction of evidence charge than the charge of complicity in a conspiracy to kill the president. We'll take our chances. So they just refused to turn anything over, said they had all been destroyed. So Here's a list of the Secret Service in the aftermath of the shooting and its participation in suppressing evidence. Remember, this is all handled by Thomas Kelly, pictured here top, and his henchman, uh, Agent Elmer Moore, pictured down at the bottom. So first, they made Richard Douglas Chuck Robertson disappear. Whether or not uh, they killed him, which I think is pretty self-evident, that he died and he's one of theirs. And there was plenty of scuttlebutt that he was killed that day. And the last witness that saw him was he was alive approaching the president's limo, and then he was taken to the ground. He disappeared. So it was the Secret Service that took him to the ground. So the Secret Service knows what happened to Chuck Robertson. They just won't say. So he disappears. That's in conjunction. That's in addition to the disappearance of Thomas Shipman 5 weeks earlier. So there's two cases of evidence suppression. Then, acting on Thomas Kelly's orders, we saw that Elmer Moore went to Dealey Plaza and confiscated everybody's film, their cameras, from regular witnesses, but also from the media. And again, acting on Kelly's orders, Moore goes to Parkland and begins intimidating the doctors into changing their testimonies about entrance, exit wounds, about the location of where the head. I put on here, it wasn't just doctors. There was the story of Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers who were in the follow-up car. They were literally in the Secret Service car behind him. And these are White House aides. And they said in the aftermath that the fatal shot came from the grassy knoll. So Elmer Moore pays them a visit and gets Kenny O'Donnell to change his story, but he never did get Dave Powers to change his story. Kenny O'Donnell changed his. So what Elmer Moore was interested in, Thomas Kelly was interested in, we need all the shots from behind to be entrance wounds, and any wounds to the front of the president head need to be exit wounds. So that's number one. And number two, we don't need anybody talking about a shot from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. That's a front shot. So those were his marching orders. And again, acting on Kelly's orders, the Secret Service, led by the driver, William Greer, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself thinking about the limo. This is just the Secret Service, the White House detail. But again, acting on Kelly's orders, they steal JFK's body, throw it in a casket, and they take it to Air Force One in preparation to get him out of Dallas, go back to DC so they can control the autopsy. Then, again, acting on Kelly's orders, William Greer, now going back to my original, what I was about ready to say, scrubs clean the crime scene, the limo, and then drives it off to a plane where it can be flown to DC and eventually to Dearborn, Michigan, to have it rebuilt. Just completely contaminated the crime scene. This was on purpose. Now, this one, acting on LBJ's instructions, the Secret Service formed a deep guard detail around a dying Lee Harvey Oswald. And you can use your imagination. They were either there to prevent him from speaking or to prevent him from living, or both. And I've always been a little bit suspicious about his death, because if you watch the scene, and it was live on TV, Jack Ruby only got one shot off, and it was to his midsection. And it looked like a survivable wound. Now, I'm not a doctor, but when you juxtapose what you saw, the one shot, and then against this story about the Secret Service guarding his bed and LBJ ordering them basically to control anything he might say if he comes to, if he regains consciousness. And he uses the words, get a deathbed confession from him, which means LBJ fully expects the outcome of this is Lee Harvey Oswald's going to die. And if one shot isn't sufficient, I'm going to have my guys there to make sure it's sufficient, make sure he dies without saying anything that might hurt the narrative. I'm sort of filling in a lot of blanks. I'm speculating, but it does create questions in my mind. And knowing what I already know about LBJ, and knowing what I already know about Secret Service, and knowing what I know about Lee Harvey Oswald being the patsy set up to take the fall, it doesn't take big leaps to come to that conclusion. I don't give the benefit of doubt to LBJ. I don't give the benefit of doubt to the Secret Service in that scenario at all. I do give the benefit of doubt to Lee Harvey Oswald. So do with that what you may. But and then lastly, Thomas Kelly, acting as the Secret Service's liaison, the Warren Commission, refused to produce any documents. Then later, the Secret Service does the same when the House Select Committee requests them. And both times they claim all those records have been destroyed. So here we've seen in the lead up to Dallas an effort to security strip the motorcade, Dealey Plaza, and the entire from Love Field all the way to wherever it's going to occur, whether it's Dealey or the Trade Mart. But the White House detail has been completely security stripped. The scene has been security stripped, which means, it's why the 112th Military Intelligence Group wasn't there. We've seen an elaborate plan to security strip the motorcade in Dallas. We've seen two Secret Service agents who became loose ends, both with prior knowledge and both who were honest brokers and weren't going to participate in a plan. Both of them disappear. We see case after case after case of evidence suppression after the fact. And it's pretty obvious to me that the Secret Service was one of the conspirators involved in the assassination in Dallas that day. Now, I already gave you the story of Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell. That top picture there's Dave Powers. He's sort of heroic in the sense that he didn't cave to the pressure from Elmer Moore. He stuck with his story about the shooting coming from the grassy knoll. And he was about as close to the president as anybody else. He was in that follow-up car, so he would know. Another Parkland doctor who never changed his story, bottom picture there, Dr. Robert McClellan. He's the guy who talked about how the back of the president's head was blasted out and never changed his story. Talked about the entrance wound in the neck. So there were some witnesses that they couldn't contain, couldn't control. Well, it wasn't through lack of effort. I'm going to give you some of the witnesses on the ground who became troublesome to the narrative. No matter notwithstanding Elmer Moore's efforts to change these people's testimony or influence their testimony. Ed Hoffman, pictured here he's the guy in the middle. He was a deaf mute. He was on the triple overpass. He pulled his car over. He was on his way, I think, it was like on his lunch hour. He was on his way to the dentist office or something. And he remembered that the president was coming through town. So he pulled over on and got out of his car and he was watching from the Stemmons Freeway, which is past the triple underpass. But it would have given him a perfect vantage point once the motorcade passed the crowd, Dealey Plaza, went under the triple underpass and began to accelerate onto the Stemmons Freeway. He was going to get to see it right there. He was going to go right by him. He was going to be within feet. It was a perfect vantage point. But I've been there, and where he was standing, as you look back towards Dealey Plaza, you can see in the distance the cars coming. You can see Elm Street. And you can also see behind the picket fence because you're standing in line with the picket fence. You're in a direct line. So if there's anything going on behind that picket fence, you're gonna see it. You're kind of 2 or 3 feet behind it yourself. So that's the vantage point that you have. Anyway, he was a deaf mute. If you know anything about people that are deaf, usually their other senses are heightened. Like they see really well, they smell really well. Uh, he was a deaf mute. He couldn't hear or talk. He signed everything, but boy, his eyesight was 20/20, right? And he's standing there. He can't hear anything. So he doesn't hear a gunshot, for example, but he sees a puff of smoke. But before he sees the puff of smoke, he's watching, waiting for the motorcade, and he's just trying to occupy his time. And he notices a man behind the picket fence who's dressed as a railroad worker. And he's carrying a bag. And then he sees another man who's dressed in a suit. He calls him Suit Man. And they're both behind the picket fence. And he's just kind of standing there watching them. And the railroad man takes something out of the bag, assembles it, and hands to Suit Man. And he realizes that's a rifle. It's an assembled rifle. He just put together a rifle. And in the next second, he sees a puff of smoke. Now, this is corroborated by all kinds of railroad workers who saw puffs of smoke coming out from underneath those trees right there behind the bushes. Anyway, Ed Hoffman sees that puff of smoke. Then he sees the Suit Man pull back, hand the rifle back to the railroad worker who disassembled it, put it back in the bag. And then as he's watching them, both men leave in opposite directions. Now, this is at the same time the president's motorcade has made the turn on the Elm, is proceeding down Elm, and you know he's watching both things simultaneously, and the motorcade is not got his full attention because he's waiting to see the motorcade when it comes right in front of him at Stemmons, but he's watching these two men behind a fence, and there was another witness. I'll come back to Ed Hoffman here in a minute, who was on leave from basic training. His name is Gordon Arnold. He was actually on the grassy knoll. He had a camera and he was going to take pictures. According to him, a man in a suit after the shooting, of course, he's not deaf, so he heard the shots. In fact, it came from behind him, he said. And he says after he's leaving the scene, this guy, Suit Man, emerges from behind. He doesn't call him Suit Man. He says a man in a suit. But put that together with Ed Hoffman saw. It's Ed Hoffman, Suit Man. And he said that this guy in a suit ordered Arnold to leave the grassy knoll. And he showed Arnold, oh, here we go again, Secret Service credentials. And this is obviously corroboration of Ed Hoffman's story that there was a man in a suit behind the picket fence. And then you have Joe Marshall Smith, a Dallas police officer. We talked about him the other day. He's got rushes up to the grassy knoll behind the picket fence. He confronts a guy in a suit and lets him go because the guy in the suit shows him Secret Service credentials. This, too, is corroboration of Hoffman's Suit Man and Arnold's Suit Man story about the Secret Service credentials. So, and then you get to Lee Bowers. Lee Bowers said that if you've ever been to Dealey Plaza, you know that there's a railroad tower. You can see it right here at the bottom picture. Shows him in the railroad tower looking through the window, the back of the picket fence. And this is the view that he would have. Anyway, he was the switchman in the railroad tower. And he said he saw two men behind the picket fence. Got one guy who looked like a railroad worker, just like Ed Hoffman saw, somebody dressed like a railroad worker, and a guy in a suit. So this is further corroboration of Hoffman's story about seeing two men behind the picket fence. And one was dressed as a railroad worker, one was dressed in a suit. Hoffman's story of a puff of smoke is corroborated by Gordon Arnold's story of a shot from that place, and and then Gordon Arnold's story of Secret Service credentials corroborates Joe Marshall Smith's story of Secret Service credentials. They both corroborate each other. The reason I bring up these witnesses is because they, like Dave Powers, were inconvenient to the story that was emerging quickly after the shooting, and that was that all the shots came from behind. There was nobody on the grassy knoll behind the picket fence. And that's what Secret Service was trying to contain. But they weren't successful with everybody. Senator Ralph Yarborough, if you remember, he was back in LBJ's car, 2 cars behind, said that when he passed, and he'd been in the military, so he understood what gunfire, the smell of gunpowder. He said when they passed the grassy knoll, he smelled gunpowder. And he said, first of all, that indicated to him where the fatal shot came from. Clearly it had to be the grassy knoll. And secondly, it had to be at ground level because he says, quote, gunpowder does not waft up downward. It rises upward. If you smell gunpowder at ground level, it's because a gun was fired from ground level. And he isn't the only one who smelled gunpowder, and a bunch of them saw smoke. So these are just a few. There's many, believe it or not. This is what Thomas Kelly was sent to Dallas to do, using Elmer Moore, was to try to contain these kinds of witnesses and their stories, their testimonies, so as to prevent an alternate theory coming out that there was a conspiracy, that there were multiple gunmen, that there was somebody on the grassy knoll, and the Secret Service was involved in all this because this suit man produced Secret Service credentials in his getaway. So, though the Secret Service tried hard to squelch these witnesses, the stories they had to tell, and though they allowed their credentials to be used as cover for these perps, the story still managed to begin to worm its way out because there were too many witnesses, too many people who saw something. And when you start putting these puzzle pieces together, even with the best efforts of the Secret Service and its evidence suppression machine, there were enough cases where evidence emerged of a second gunman, of people behind the picket fence, of gunpowder, of smoke, of people flashing Secret Service badges to at least cause suspicion that has never gone away. In fact, it's only intensified with time because we have access now to technology that, for example, when when the Warren Commission was investigating in '64, they didn't have access to the audio recordings of the policemen in the motorcade. We didn't get that till 15 years later in the House Select Committee when the dicta belt was examined by a forensic, actually by some sort of audio recording expert company. Well, I don't know what you call it. They listened to the recordings and they performed whatever testing that they do on those kinds of recordings, and they determined that at least one shot came from the grassy knoll. And they were able to count the number of shots. There were way more than 3. And all of a sudden, the narrative that had stood for 15 years starts crumbling. That's because of technology. And there are other ways technology has influenced over the period of time, but it's been 60 years. And more evidence has emerged. More and more documents have been released grudgingly, but they've been released. And when you start putting these puzzle pieces together, you start seeing the complicity of, in this case, the Secret Service, how the security stripping was meticulous. It was purposeful. It was planned. It was all done in advance so as to keep up appearances of Secret Service protection. But in reality, it was a paper tiger. It was a shell of its former self. And then to clean up the scene afterwards, guys like Thomas Kelly and Elmer Moore were sent in to suppress as much evidence as possible. And in spite of that, it's a miracle, but in spite of that, evidence has emerged nonetheless. And it paints a pretty bleak picture of the Secret Service, in my opinion. Okay, so today's question, hopefully we answered. Just a quick review of all the questions that we've been looking at. First was there any indication prior to Dallas that JFK might be the victim of an assassination attempt that the Secret Service should be on high alert for? And the answer to that was clearly yes. And a second question was, when contaminating or corrupting the Secret Service, does it require everyone? And the answer to that was no. You just needed Raleigh at the top to change all the personnel assignments. You needed Emory Roberts on the ground in Dallas to oversee things in the moment in real time to make sure the plans went according to plan, or the operation went according to plan. Then you need Thomas Kelly there ready and waiting after the shooting to clean up everything with his henchman, Elmer Moore. You need those four guys. Everybody else, that's why you replace experienced agents with inexperienced agents, because they're just going to take orders. They're going to do whatever they're told. And they did. And then we looked at another question was were there enough examples of security breakdowns that could convince someone that this was not incompetence, this was not inexperience, rather this was a purposeful effort to strip away the security of the protectee so as to make him a big, ripe, juicy target, bringing him into a kill zone between multiple rifle teams? I think the answer we've shown clearly, yes. And then today's question, was there any evidence after the fact that the Secret Service participated in a cover-up? And hopefully I answered that question, that yes, there were multiple examples of evidence suppression that, if the Secret Service had nothing to hide, would not have been necessary. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for joining. Until next time, God bless.